I love me some Shantae. When describing only its basic features, it's pretty easy to see why. It's a 2D platformer with an open world, lots of secrets, optional upgrades, a killer soundtrack, memorable characters with fun dialogue and probably the most personality you'll see in a Game Boy game, and a cute Middle Eastern girl protagonist who shows a lot of skin. Despite everything it has going for it, it's not perfect. It's one of the best action games on the Game Boy Color, yet I had enough frustrating moments in my first playthrough to warrant its issues a mention. With Half Genie Hero around the corner, I wanted to make a video going into detail on the original Shantae, so I'm going to spend an inappropriate amount of time talking about pretty much every detail I can think of about the game. Being released near the end of the Game Boy Color's life, after the Game Boy Advance was out actually, there's a good chance you haven't played it, so keep in mind there are going to be spoilers of both the story and the gameplay variety. Okay, I'll just start from the beginning. Hey, it's Shantae. One of Shantae's strongest points is its presentation, and the entire opening section here is nice. I don't have much to say about it in depth, but it's a typical example of perfectly blending gameplay with narrative and presentation. This really ramps up once you get into the town. The music kicks in, you see citizens running away, the Tinkerbat's animations and everything. It really gives credence to this depiction of a town under siege. Again, nothing special, nothing in depth, but I think it's an expertly executed segment, and it's just the beginning of the whole series' pristine track record of, like I mentioned earlier, great presentation of its story and overall just being stylish. The cutscene here is quick and simple, but it's a great introduction to Risky's character. One of the series' main strengths is its characters, and I think Risky is the most obvious example of that. She's a super fun villain, she's cocky, and she loves being evil. Look at her lying nonchalantly on her ship like that, with her big smile on her face. She's a straightforward character, but her character is highly effective, and I just love her. Anyway, I just wanted to mention how much I love this opening part. In fact, I think the beginning of Shantae is where it shines brightest. After the intro, you start out in Scuffed Town, and I gotta say, I love the way the game handles exploring towns. It's essentially just a menu disguised as being in control of Shantae from a different camera angle. It kinda reminds me of more modern day attempts by games to use in-universe things in place of HUD elements, like Dead Space using the lights on the player's back as a health indicator. That's always the example that comes to my mind for that. While I'm usually ambivalent to games doing things like this, it works very well with the towns in Shantae because it functions pretty much exactly like a traditional menu would, just with a neat presentation. The animation for Shantae running into buildings is really nice too, notable due to its detail compared to the rest of the game, which already has high animation quality for a Game Boy Color game. Mimic tells you to head to Watertown, and what I like is that he doesn't tell you which way that is. When you leave Scuffed Town, you can go left or right. Which one could it be? It's a mystery. If you go left, you're gonna get destroyed by sexy snake women. I mean, maybe you won't. You might make it to the point where you have to turn into a monkey, and if you do, then you'll be like, oh okay, this is a Metroidvania, so I need to come back when I have something new. And you'll be right, Shantae is a Metroidvania. On the way to Watertown, the tile set changes from a desert-like area to a wheat field, and then the forest, and it's nice. Shantae has a variety of environments throughout the game, and the good graphics to show them off. I mean, obviously Shantae looks great. I'm a big fan of well-made sprite art and animation, and I'm particularly impressed by what WayForward accomplished with the low resolution offered by the Game Boy Color. I know there's not a lot interesting about just, hey, this game has good graphics, but it's particularly significant for Shantae because it complements what I earlier mentioned is Shantae's strongest point, which is its presentation. The characters, enemies, and environments are all memorable in a way they wouldn't be if Shantae had the same style and graphical quality of most other Game Boy Color games. It even complements some aspects of the gameplay, particularly Such graphical quality shouldn't come as a surprise to those familiar with WayForward's other works. Stylistically, it's even on par with the classic Windy Every Which Way. Shantae herself is, in general, the most obvious example of the game's good visuals. More importantly, she's a great example of how video game characters can be given characterization just visually. She isn't a silent protagonist, and has plenty to say throughout the series, but compared to the two sequels, she doesn't really have that much dialogue in the first game. Still, the player can get a good idea of some basic personality traits just from her animations. Unfortunately, the trip to Watertown is where the game starts to really show its weaknesses. In the area with these purple cliffs, obviously there's a lot of verticality. Shantae goes down, then up and down and so on as you go through this area. At least on your first few times through, you'll likely have a sense of unease the whole time. You pretty much never know what's below you as you jump down, and sometimes what might feel like a natural jump could be a jump to your death. This is a problem that's pervasive throughout the game. The game makes the player take leaps of faith a lot. In Shantae, I lost count of how many times I had to drop off a ledge with no indication that I wasn't just jumping into a death pit. Most of the time I did, it turned out to be okay. It turned out that's where I needed to go. But sometimes I was wrong, and it feels bad to die just because you guessed wrong. It seems like WayForward was kind of aware of this issue because they added the float muffins to the game. The player could just use the float muffins anytime they want to test a drop, but if you ask me, that's not a good solution at all. The muffins cost money, the player has to open the inventory, equip them, use them, and if they want to have another item equipped, go back and re-equip that. It's slow, unskillful, and it wouldn't be necessary if the level design were just better. I think the issues I have with the gameplay in Shantae can mostly be blamed on the small screen size. The Game Boy Color obviously had a pretty small resolution, and WayForward wanted the game to be of high visual quality, which it absolutely is. Part of achieving this meant Shantae had to have a relatively large sprite. Compare her size on the screen to, for example, Mario in Mario Land. Unfortunately, this had an undesirable effect on the gameplay. It's the main culprit behind the issues I mentioned earlier with often having to make leaps of faith. The worst part about it, though, in my opinion, is the effect it has on Shantae's speed. Shantae walks pretty slowly, but she runs pretty quickly. Problem is, the game discourages the player from running because of its screen size. Since there's relatively little space between Shantae and the edge of the screen, running can often result in hitting an enemy or a pit that the player has very little time to react to. This is exacerbated by the fact that you have to hold the attack button to run. Some other games do it this way and it's just a minor annoyance, but in Shantae it's a bit worse, because, like I said, the game often discourages you from running. When the player is going to want to frequently go back and forth between running to save time and walking to be cautious, it sucks to have to attack anytime you want to run. As I'm going through the overworld, there are a lot of times where I want to run just a short distance, but the time it takes to attack first makes it so that running that short distance isn't actually any faster than just continuing to walk. Due to the limited buttons of the Game Boy Color, I don't know a better way to handle it, but it bugged me so much on my first playthrough I just had to mention it. Even the broader issue of limited screen space, would I have chosen to make Shantae and her enemies smaller if I'd been in charge? No, I wouldn't. Shantae looks great, and despite my usual preference for prioritizing gameplay over all else in video games, I really wouldn't want to take away from one of the things that makes Shantae stand out most. Okay, sorry, I'm done complaining for now. Okay, Watertown, Bolo, okay. Ta-ta! The first dungeon, Dribble Fountain, here we go. The dungeons in Shantae are great. As far as gameplay goes, I think they're the strongest point. I find Dribble Fountain to be the least interesting of them though. Don't get me wrong, I still think it's nice, I just don't really have much to say about it. I guess it's appropriate that it would be a pretty simple dungeon since it's the first one. Most games, Shantae included, have fairly linear difficulty curves after all. It does all the things right you'd expect of a Metroidvania or a Zelda-like game such as Shantae. You see things earlier on in the dungeon that you can't do anything with, but you suspect you'll be able to later, and it turns out you can. And the main factor in that is the monkey. Yes, it's time. We're here. We made it. It's time to talk about Shantae's animal forms. I know you've been waiting for me to talk about this monkey. What a cutie. I want to pat that monkey on the head. Except that would be weird because it's Shantae. So she'd probably just change back into a human and be like, hey, come on. I know you know that was me. Do you usually just go up to random girls and pat them on the head? Maybe, yeah. Shantae's animal forms are a great addition to the game. They work well thematically because, of course, Shantae is a half-genie. Being a half-genie instead of a full genie, Shantae's power needs to be something that's not too powerful, but still pretty significant. And I'd say being able to completely shapeshift into a different creature is a really significant power. But it doesn't just make her a force of destruction that can nuke all the bosses. That kind of balance works well for both the narrative and the gameplay. The animal form's effects on gameplay aren't all good though. A complaint I've heard multiple times, and which I agree with, is how often changing forms kills the pacing of the gameplay. Look at this part here. I just want to jump up here real quick, and I gotta be a monkey to do that, so I have to spend all this time dancing to turn into a monkey, and then almost immediately I have to switch back. And the vast majority of that time was just going through the transformation process, which I've already seen several times before, and that kind of situation crops up quite a bit throughout the game. I don't want to talk about the later games too much in this video, but both of them made changes to animal forms. And I like the way those games did things, but I don't think changing the way the transformation itself works is necessarily the solution. Not every bit of gameplay needs to be totally fast-paced, and I think having the transformation process involve Shantae dancing and doing her dramatic pose as she changes back is quite cool. I think the real solution is already within the first Shantae game itself. When you get the first monkey transformation, you transform here, and then you can stay as a monkey for a little while, and soon you use it again to climb up this wall. It's fine that the transformation takes a while in that case because, I mean, number one, it's your first time using the power, and number two, you stay in that form for a decent amount of time. Later on you get the Harpy transformation, and again, when you use that form throughout the dungeon, you don't ever really transform into a Harpy, use it for just a couple seconds, and then switch back. You turn into a Harpy, and then stay in Harpy form for a while. Later on, if you decide to do the natural thing, and explore the skies of the Overworld as a Harpy, again, you're getting a lot of use out of it, all at once. It's not going to bother people to just take 5 seconds to do the transformation. The elephant form does it right as well, but differently. The elephant transformation isn't used as much as the other forms generally, but when you do use it, it's a lot more significant, usually. The most memorable use of it to me is breaking this wall leading to the east. You spend several seconds transforming, break the wall, and immediately switch back, but it doesn't feel tedious because you're accomplishing something really significant with it. You're not making just a little jump that was just barely too high as regular Shantae. You're breaking open a big wall that's been keeping you out of a whole new area for the whole game up to that point. So in general, I guess the thing to take away is that a longer, slower paced transformation isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just important to make what you're doing seem significant, however that may be. Wow, I talked about that forever. Monkey cute. After beating this labyrinth, I was calling them dungeons earlier because I'm stupid. They're called labyrinths in Shantae. After Dribble Fountain, you go back west to Oasis Town. Since the player is going to stop by Scuffed Town again, I want to talk about the minigames. In Scuffed Town, of course, we have the dance parlor. This is where Shantae goes to shake what her mama gave her. Her genie mama. I love the dance parlor minigame. It fits the theme of the game perfectly, like, yeah, a cute genie who belly dances to use her magic, why wouldn't she put that to use to make some extra dosh? I would. Something I've heard people complain about in Shantae is that items from the shops are too expensive. It's understandable because enemies drop so little money when you spend a while whipping one of the stronger enemies, and they drop literally 1 gem. It's like, Wow, that's pretty stupid. Thing is, if you get decent at the dance parlor minigame, you never have to worry about money again. Playing it on B rank isn't too hard, and you can make money really quickly that way. Minigames in many games often seem like afterthoughts, something you'll do once and be like, okay, well that's in the game, pretty cute, haha. While the dance parlor minigame is by no means required, it's incredibly helpful, and I really appreciate a minigame being implemented in such a significant way. Players are rewarded heavily for making use of the resources available to them in the game. The Gecko game is pretty neat too. You can theoretically make money here even faster, though I prefer the dance parlor because it's more skill-based instead of being, you know, dice rolls. I enjoy the 3 different gamers you can face in the Gecko chamber. Such a simple thing kind of fleshes out the world a little bit better. Not to mention more NPCs means more opportunity for the game to show off way forward sick animation. Since I'm kind of on the subject of the purchasable items already, I want to mention the fighter's gear real quick. The fighter's gear itself is a mixed bag. The flip kick can be useful for hitting enemies above, but the follow-up drill kick doesn't really do enough damage to be worth either the initial gold investment or even just bothering to do it at all. The elbow dash alone isn't worth using, but the spin attack follow-up does so much damage it might actually be worth getting both of them. Personally, my last playthrough, I never really used any of these moves. I just whipped stuff to death. But your first playthrough, if you're trying to be thorough and kill, like, these guys here, the dash and spin move can be super useful if you're taking it slow. Thing is, are you actually gonna invest in the fighter's gear on your first playthrough? The stuff is super expensive. Worst part is, if you get one of the pieces that lets you do a follow-up move before the one that lets you do the initial move, it's totally worthless. You can't do anything with it. The only way to know that in advance is by talking to this one NPC. This may be an unusual way to think about it, but I personally like that. Yes, the average player has a decent chance of wasting a lot of money on something that'll be useless to them for a while, but as a massive video game elitist, I see that more as a way of rewarding players who are cautious and who pay attention to their surroundings. When you see that the gear costs so much, maybe you'll hold off on buying it, yeah? And then you'll end up talking to this NPC. Maybe. I don't know. I like it. Okay, Oasis Town. To get to Oasis Town, the player has to go across the desert. I think the Overworld shows off the weaknesses of the gameplay in general. Along with the things I mentioned earlier, the trip to Oasis Town can really highlight this. The biggest issue to me is the enemies, or more specifically, the optimal way to deal with them. The overworld areas of Shantae have lots of enemies. Some of them are 1 or 2 hits, some of them are tankier. These snake women are pretty cool, probably my favorite individual enemies in fact. To avoid their shots you actually have to get close to them, and if you're not, you're gonna get hit. Their shots are fast, and they track you. Thing is, there are a lot of them throughout the path to Oasis Town. You could spend a lot of time whipping each one to death, risking getting hit each time and possibly dying before making it to the town, or you could just do this. If you're decent at dancing at the parlor, Vanish Cream seems pretty cheap. I just praised the snake women, and yeah, fighting them is fun, but at the end of the day, if you're traveling between the towns for the 3rd or 4th time, you're gonna get tired of taking each one out on your way. More importantly, I said the snake women are my favorite enemy. These spear enemies can just spawn inside of you. These waterfall fish, they're fair if you're familiar with the game, but if you're not, you're gonna blindly run into them unless you're walking, which is annoyingly slow. These archer chicks would be cool, except you can just run past them and they'll never hit you, so they may as well not be there. These snails take 1 billion hits to kill and are extremely easy to just jump over anyway, so you'll just do that. And that's if you're here during the day. They're gone at night. In general, the enemies on the overworld are either ineffective or are so tedious the player is incentivized to just Vanish Cream past them. I don't really like talking about all this because, like I said, I'm a big fan of Shantae, and more specifically, I love the idea behind all of these enemies. To give credit where it's due, even as they are, these enemies they all add character to the world of Shantae. So let me quit being such an idiot and stop complaining for a bit. Being an open world side-scroller, you'd expect Shantae to have plenty of collectibles, and it doesn't disappoint. There are two main gameplay elements in Shantae that I think are superb, and this is one of them. Shantae has an open world that's meant to be explored, and the hearts, fireflies, and squids are the reason it's not only good in that regard, but great. Oh wait, hang on a sec. One thing I want to mention in detail is the warp squids. To remind you of how they work, each town has a squid hut with a big warp squid mama who's lost her baby warp squids, and if you collect 4 of them and bring them back to their mother, you can perform a dance to warp back to that town. After I'd beaten the game for the first time, I had only unlocked warping at 2 towns. Of course, being able to warp to more towns near the end of the game would be less useful, since you have the Harpy Form at that point, which makes traversal of the overworld easier and faster. I actually like the fact that warping between towns isn't that accessible. I generally dislike fast travel in games because it really just means more time spent in menus and less time actually playing the game. But I still think some amount of fast travel, especially as a reward for exploration, is nice if you're going to be going between towns multiple times, so I think Shantae 1 strikes a really nice balance. I like Sky's designs in RR and PC, but this one will always be my favorite. Elephant World has one of my favorite gimmicks of any dungeon-type area in any game. As is the case throughout the Shantae series, the puzzles here are not terribly difficult. Video games are for children, after all. But the magnetization mechanic is really cool. These parts where you have to actually avoid the colors are nice because they force you to use the monkey form. Like I mentioned earlier, the transformations are at their best when they're being used in a significant way, and for longer periods. When using monkey here, you have to stay monkey for a bit because you're climbing walls and stuff. You also kind of feel clever because, you know, you're using it to avoid something and not just to jump up to something. This boss is neat. The elephant is usually required to break large boulders and stuff, so when you're attacking this thing as the elephant, you feel like you're doing a ton of damage to it. Oh yeah, and at this point, it should be pretty clear why I called this game Zelda-like earlier. Lots of people, myself included of course, call Shantae a Metroidvania, and it absolutely is. But if I wanted to compare it to any other game series, it would be Zelda. And the flow of the dungeons shows that more than anything else in a way that I think is pretty obvious. Okay, zombie caravan, Roddy. Dude, it's her. Wow. I'm a huge fan of cheesy depictions of scary things, like cartoony, Halloween-y stuff is my favorite. So, needless to say, I love the depictions of zombies in the Shantae universe. I don't have anything interesting or insightful to say about this. I'm just gushing over stuff I like at this point. Who cares? Really though, like I've said, one of Shantae's main strengths is its personality, its dialogue, its feeling, stuff like that, and the zombies are one of the big contributors to that, for sure. As for Roddy Tops in particular, she's one of my favorite examples of Shantae's visuals having a good effect. Roddy Tops is quite bouncy in more than one way, and that, combined with her big innocent grin, really conveys her character before she even says anything. I appreciate that this foot race with Roddy is so difficult. I can't remember for sure, but I'm pretty sure you can literally only make one mistake and still win. Wow. Roddy Tops. Kaufman tries to use a stealth mechanic. It's pretty basic, and not that useful, but it's a nice thought to go along with a spooky labyrinth. The real fun comes from the eyeball platforms. And the eyeballs. It's a bit frustrating to get the eyeballs to go where you want them, but I somehow found that to be part of the puzzle's charm. Functionally, I don't think the spider is used to its full potential. It climbs walls, which is pretty much what you'd expect of a spider form, But, monkey already climbs walls. Oh, but the spider climbs walls from this direction. Oh, cool. It's still kind of neat just because of the previously inaccessible things it lets you get to, but to call back to what I was saying earlier, nothing you do with it really feels significant to me. Maybe that's because my first playthrough I actually got over here before I got the spider form, because I thought the float muffins were the solution. I suppose that would seem pretty cool if I had solved it with the spider. Anyway, I'm probably judging the spider form too much. Like, I like the spider form. I think it serves the general Metroidvania purpose of, you know, giving you access to stuff you couldn't get to earlier, but you could see it, and now you can get to it. And it just looks cool. I like it. I want to make that clear. I like it. One thing I do like is how you use the spider against the boss. What I like even more is that you don't have to. You can just jump over the boss and whip it. That's slower, but I always like more options, and I just think it's funny to beat the boss this way. Hey man. Hey. What's your favorite track from Shantae? Mine's Zombie Town. Actually, I mean the boss fight song. Nah, you know, actually, I mean, Scuffed Town. I'm not actually qualified to critique music at all. I just would feel like an idiot if I didn't mention it. Shantae's music is A+. I don't really like music from Game Boy games, usually, but the tracks from Shantae actually make me like the sounds available on it. My favorite little detail is when you beat a boss, it plays, like, part of the boss track as a victory theme. I don't know, that just sticks out to me a lot as a cool detail. Those who are still watching the video probably already know this, but the soundtrack was done by the brilliant Jake Kaufman. If you're an idiot and don't already know, he's also worked on the other Shantae games, as well as Mighty Switch Force and Shovel Knight. Lots of other stuff too, but I think the soundtracks of those three series alone are enough to command a lot of respect. I hope Risky dresses up like a genie again in Half Genie Hero. I like Ice City a lot. Second to Elephant World, in fact. It seems to be the most dense with things to do, and it's where you get by far my favorite animal form. The Harpy lets Shantae fly, so with it your movement is totally free. The main reason I like it though isn't because it lets you fly, but the heavy momentum in its movement. I love platformers with relatively low air control or just even movement control, the kind some critics might call floaty. Shantae isn't like that at all. It gives you total air control, and Shantae's movement when running or jumping is instantaneous. So it's the opposite of what I usually like in platformers, but that's fine. Plenty of classic platformers do it that way, but I still have my preferences. When in Harpy Form, controlling your momentum becomes the challenge, just like in many of my favorite platformers. And the momentum with Shantae's Harpy Form is some of the heaviest I've experienced. Personally, I love it. It kind of seems like a shame that you only get the Harpy Form near the end of the game, but I mean, it frees up your movement so much that getting it earlier on would let the player skip so much, it would just be pretty stupid. Still, I hope the Harpy Form ends up in Half Genie Hero, and I hope it controls similarly. Having to use the Harpy Form to find the spy scope in the desert is obviously just because it's the last form you unlock, but I think it's good for presenting the story. Being able to fly gives the player a powerful feeling more than just about anything, and having to do it before taking Risky on made me feel like I was really ready to actually fight her. The area leading up to her, the Tinkerbat Factory, is pretty straightforward, and that in itself is a pretty cool choice. For the first time in the game, the area is totally linear. It just gave me a feeling of building up to a boss fight, and it made what I was doing feel more like, well, what Shantae is actually doing. She's not exploring a labyrinth, she's breaking into Risky's base of operations. This is really hammered in by the part here where you break down the metal door. I love that detail, it's sick. The first part of the fight with the Tinker Tank is notable because it has a hint of being a small labyrinth in and of itself. Maybe I'm like analyzing too hard here, but that's the idea I got from having to turn into a bird and fly up to the top of the face. Man, that looks cool. This is by far the hardest boss fight in the game, which I think is pretty cool. Risky appears just to be a mostly regular woman. She's not a giant statue, she's not a big robot, she doesn't have a dragon to ride, she's just a person with a sword. So the fact that she's a lot harder than the other stuff is really cool. Maybe that's just me reading too much into things again, I don't know. If you use some items against her, she's not that big of a deal, but I prefer just whipping her because it makes the fight more intense. Then again, every time I've tried to beat her that way, I just end up using like 3 potions, so it kind of defeats the purpose. Oh yeah, when I was recording this fight, Shantae turned weird colors for some reason. I saw this happen to someone else when they were speedrunning Shantae in Twinkle City, I think, but I have no idea what causes it. Also, those of you who've only played Pirate's Curse, but are watching this video for some reason, you thought PC invented Hair Down Risky? Think again, idiots. This is OG Hair Down Risky right before your eyes. This game is so cool. Oh yeah, this part here, where you're flying away as a harpy. In any other game, this would go on for way too long, I guarantee you. In Shantae, this lasts like 15 seconds or something. It does not overstay its welcome at all. It's perfect. Look at her little smiley face on her harpy face. Her harpy face. Nice. What a great ending. Shantae gets offered the chance to become a full genie, but then she has to go live in the genie realm with other genies and not talk to humans ever again. So she turns it down because that would mean never helping them or seeing her friends again. It's not like a terribly original kind of plot thing that's happening here, but it's cute. And I mean, it does have an effect. It's cliché for a good reason. There's no doubt after this that Shantae has a sense of justice and cares for the people around her. She's pure of heart. Okay, so that's me talking about Shantae. I have a lot more I want to say about it, but it would mostly just be me saying, hey, this is in the game, and I like it, which isn't very insightful. And I've already done a lot of that as it is in the video, so... At the same time, though, I've spent more time talking about Shantae's flaws than most players would. It's mostly because I enjoy nitpicking the things I like. I said at the beginning of this video that Shantae is one of the best action games on the Game Boy Color, and indeed, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better action game on the Game Boy Color than Shantae. So, really, the fact that I tried to analyze it like I would a game for any other platform just means I'm an idiot. But, whatever. While most of the gameplay flaws in Shantae can be blamed on its platform, the main point I want to make is that, at least to me, they're vastly overshadowed by the feeling the game conveys through its art design, animations, characters, dialogue, and its general sense of an exploration adventure. All of those elements, combined with a unique and lovable protagonist, work together to take the game from being just a pretty good Metroidvania to one of my personal favorites. Okay, done. I just spent a long time talking about Shantae. Oh well. I might make a video about Risky's Revenge and or Pirate's Curse. I might not. Okay? Okay? Thank you. Thank you, bye-bye.